are linked in more ways than one cares to know or admit. One love, one people, one destiny. We forget that. This is what we get. We get the global equivalent of the blues. This case, a lot of people think I ain't got no money blues. I don't have job blues. No money, no jobs. People in high places weaving webs of lies and deception. Jah forgive us, for we know not what we do. We are linked in more ways than one would care to know or admit. One love, one people, one destiny. But if we don't forget that, if we don't forget that, we might still have a chance. I wrote this piece, Fatherhood, for my daughter Rose. Years ago, back in the early days of the Reggae Theatre Ensemble, Rose Daniels would oftentimes ask, well, when are you going to write something about me? When are you going to write something about me? She heard the stories about the Daniels boys. She heard the stories about Uncle Yancey, but when was that time going to come for her? This also was also a part of Black Hippie Chronicles, because Black Hippie Chronicles was a story about perspective. It was a story about a young African-American man who found his way to Rasta through peace and pot of the 60s and early 70s. And you know, some of that remains, obviously. Here I am today. But sometimes you look at different things from a different lens as one gets older. Fatherhood. I spoke to you while you were still in the womb. I asked you to give your mother a little rest, but you refused and kicked her harder for good measure. I spoke to you when you were in tears to say, everything will be all right. You listened long enough to cry one more time, even louder. I guess you call it a lung exercise. You try to see if the words would cease. Watch out, be careful, don't stop, hold my hand. Sometimes you listened, and sometimes you would play the rebel. But this one thing you should know, and this one thing is my role, to speak to you from flesh to spirit, from spirit to flesh, and to say, I am your father. So much, so much, so much things to say. So much, so much, so much things to say right now. As it was in the beginning, Jah, Rastafari from the beginning of time. So much things to say. My story, Root's story, this story. This story began in Africa. This story began in America. This story began in a third grade classroom, November 22nd, 1963. It began in a haze of ganja smoke, imagined in 1968, and in Rio, in Da Nang, Khe Sanh, Hanoi, Memphis, and the Ambassador Hotel. This story begins in your mind and in your heart. This story begins on Sunday night with television. Death Valley Days with Ronald Reagan as your host. This story begins. This story begins with voices. Voices, words, sounds, power. Words, sounds, power. Stories passed on from I past to I present to our future. And once again, it's been a pleasure to be part of the Mercury Cafe and all of you fine people, Denver, Colorado. Thank you very much.